Everyone laughed when he filled his barn with old tractors. Until the day they begged him for help. Frank Kowalski stood in his massive barn, surrounded by 37 vintage tractors that his neighbors had spent the last 15 years calling junk, watching those same neighbors now approach his property with their hats in their hands and desperation in their eyes. The devastating hailstorm had destroyed every piece of modern farming equipment within 50 miles of Millerville, Iowa, leaving the county's most successful farmers with millions of dollars in damaged machinery and crops that needed harvesting in the next 10 days, or they'd lose everything. But Frank's 1940s and 1950s tractors, the ones everyone had mocked as museum pieces and waste of good barn space, had survived the storm without a scratch, and now represented the only hope for saving the harvest that would determine whether these farms survived another year. As Frank watched his neighbor Tom Bradley, the same man who'd called him crazy old Frank and his rust buckets just last week, walk slowly up his gravel driveway with a look of humble desperation that Frank had never seen before, he knew this moment would change everything about how people saw both him and the machines he'd spent decades collecting and restoring. Subscribe to this channel if you've ever been laughed at for following your passion, and let me know in the comments what hobby or interest people have mocked you for, because this story will show you that sometimes the things others don't understand become exactly what the world needs most. The mockery had started 15 years ago, when Frank Kowalski made the decision that would define the rest of his life. At 62, recently retired from his job as a mechanic at the John Deere dealership in Cedar Rapids, Frank used his entire retirement savings to buy 40 acres of farmland just outside Millerville and began what his neighbors considered the strangest farming operation anyone had ever seen. Instead of planting crops or raising livestock, Frank started collecting vintage tractors. Not just any vintage tractors, but specifically machines from the 1940s and 1950s. Farmalls, John Deeres, Alice Chalmers, Fords, and Massey Fergusons that other farmers had given up on decades ago. Tractors that sat rusting in fence rows, abandoned in overgrown lots, or gathering dust in the back corners of implement dealers who couldn't sell them. Frank would drive hundreds of miles to buy a 1947 Farmall H with a seized engine, or a 1952 Ford 8N with a cracked block, or a 1948 John Deere B that hadn't run since the Carter administration. He'd haul these machines back to his property on a flatbed trailer, then spend months in his workshop, bringing them back to life with a patience and skill that amazed even the skeptics. The problem was, nobody understood why he was doing it. Frank's lost his mind, Tom Bradley told anyone who would listen at the coffee shop in downtown Millerville. Tom owned 2,400 acres of prime Iowa farmland and operated one of the most successful grain operations in the county. Man's got a barn full of antiques when he could be making money farming that land properly. It's like a tractor graveyard over there, agreed Sarah Chen, who farmed 1/800 acres on the opposite side of town. My grandfather had better equipment than what Frank's collecting, and Grandpa's been dead for 30 years. He's spent more money on rust and old iron than I spend on new equipment, added Mike Peterson, whose 3,200-acre operation was considered the most modern and efficient in the county. Those old tractors couldn't pull a sick dog off a porch. But Frank Kowalski had a vision that none of his neighbors understood. During his 43 years working on farm equipment, he'd seen the agricultural industry transform from simple, repairable machines to complex computerized systems that required specialized diagnostic equipment and factory-trained technicians to service. Modern tractors were marvels of engineering, but they were also completely dependent on electronic systems, GPS navigation, and computer-controlled functions that made them vulnerable in ways their predecessors had never been. Frank remembered the stories his father had told him about farming during World War II, when parts for farm equipment were scarce and farmers had to keep their machines running with ingenuity, spare parts from other equipment, and mechanical knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Those old tractors had been built to last, built to be repaired in the field with basic tools, built to run on determination when everything else failed. People think I'm collecting junk, Frank told his wife Helen one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch, overlooking the neat rows of restored tractors in his barn. They don't understand that I'm preserving knowledge. Every one of those machines represents engineering solutions that modern equipment has forgotten. Helen Kowalski had learned to trust her husband's instincts over their 45 years of marriage. She'd supported him through career changes, business ventures, and countless projects that had seemed questionable to outsiders, but had always proven worthwhile in the end. "What kind of knowledge?" she asked. "How to build things that last. How to fix things with whatever parts you have available. How to keep machines running when the computer systems fail and the dealership is 200 miles away." Frank pointed to his collection. "Every one of those tractors can be fixed with a wrench, a hammer, and some creativity. Try doing that with a modern combine that needs a software update every time you change the oil." Frank's collection grew steadily over the years. He developed relationships with farmers, dealers, and collectors across 5 states who would call him when they came across machines that matched his criteria. He bought tractors at estate auctions, salvage yards, and farm closures, always focusing on models from the golden age of American agriculture, when machinery was built for durability rather than complexity. Each tractor that arrived at Frank's farm underwent a complete restoration process that could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Frank would disassemble the entire machine, rebuild the engine, restore the transmission and hydraulic systems, sandblast and repaint the body, and replace every worn component until the tractor ran like new. He maintained detailed records of every restoration, photographed every step of the process, and kept comprehensive inventories of parts and specifications for each machine. The neighbors' mockery intensified as Frank's collection grew. What had started as gentle ribbing about his hobby evolved into genuine concern about his mental state. "Frank's building a tractor museum instead of a farm," Tom Bradley complained to the county extension agent. "It's bringing down property values for everyone in the area. People drive by just to gawk at his antique collection, instead of looking at our productive agricultural operations." "It's like living next to a junkyard," added Sarah Chen. "My grandson asked me why the crazy man has so many broken tractors. How do you explain that to a kid?" The criticism reached its peak in 2019 when Frank installed a large pole barn specifically designed to house his collection. The building was 200 feet long and 80 feet wide, with specialized ventilation systems, concrete floors, and individual spaces for each tractor. The construction cost over $180,000, money that Frank's neighbors believed should have been spent on productive farming equipment or land improvement. "He could have bought a brand new combine harvester for what he spent on that building," Mike Peterson told his coffee shop audience. "Instead, he's got a climate-controlled museum for machines that should have been scrapped 40 years ago." But Frank had a plan that went beyond simple collecting or restoration. He was developing what he called his agricultural insurance policy, a comprehensive fleet of vintage machines that could handle every farming operation from planting to harvest, all maintained in working condition and ready for immediate use. Frank's collection included tractors for every possible farming application, compact utility models for yard work and small tasks, mid-sized machines for cultivating and planting, and large tractors capable of pulling heavy equipment for harvesting and tillage. He had acquired matching implements for each tractor: plows, discs, cultivators, planters, mowers, rakes, and balers, all restored to working condition and designed to interface with the mechanical systems of vintage equipment. Most importantly, Frank had spent years learning to manufacture his own replacement parts, using a machine shop he'd built in a separate building on his property. He could fabricate gears, rebuild hydraulic cylinders, machine new engine components, and repair virtually any mechanical problem that might arise with his vintage fleet. What modern farmers saw as obsolete technology, Frank saw as ultimate reliability. These machines were built during a time when farmers had to be their own mechanics, Frank explained to a reporter from Farm Implement magazine who was writing an article about vintage tractor collecting. They were designed to be repaired in the field with basic tools. The engineering solutions were elegant and simple. A farmer could keep these tractors running for decades with nothing more than mechanical knowledge and determination. The reporter was intrigued by Frank's philosophy, but skeptical about its practical applications. Don't modern tractors offer significant advantages in terms of efficiency, comfort, and productivity? Absolutely, Frank acknowledged. Modern equipment is faster, more comfortable, more precise, and more fuel efficient. But it's also completely dependent on systems that can fail catastrophically. GPS navigation, computer-controlled transmissions, electronic fuel injection, diagnostic systems that require specialized equipment to service. When those systems work, modern tractors are incredible machines. When they don't work, they become very expensive paperweights. The reporter pressed further. But surely the reliability advantages of modern equipment outweigh the risks of system failures? Frank smiled and gestured toward his collection. That depends on your definition of reliability. Modern equipment is reliable as long as everything works perfectly. These old machines are reliable even when nothing works perfectly. There's a difference. The article, when it was published 6 months later, portrayed Frank as an eccentric but knowledgeable collector whose passion for vintage equipment had created an impressive museum of agricultural history. The article also mentioned Frank's theory about the vulnerability of modern farming systems, but treated it as an interesting philosophical perspective rather than a practical concern. Frank's neighbors read the article with a mixture of amusement and frustration. "Now he's got magazine articles written about his junk collection," Tom Bradley grumbled. "Next thing you know, he'll be charging admission for tours of his tractor museum." But Frank wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He was interested in preparedness. And on the morning of August 15, 2023, his years of preparation would finally prove their worth. The storm system that devastated Millerville and the surrounding agricultural region came without warning. Weather forecasters had predicted severe thunderstorms with possible hail, but nothing approaching the catastrophic damage that actually occurred. The supercell that formed over southeastern Iowa that afternoon generated hailstones ranging from golf ball to softball size, accompanied by straight-line winds exceeding 90 miles per hour. Frank was in his workshop when the storm hit, rebuilding the transmission on a 1951 Farmall Super C. He heard the initial rumble of thunder around 3 p.m., but thunderstorms were common in August, and he didn't think much of it. When the hail started at 3:47 p.m., Frank moved to the window to watch what he assumed would be a typical Iowa hailstorm. Impressive, but brief. What he saw instead was apocalyptic. Hailstones the size of baseballs were falling with such intensity that the ground disappeared beneath a white carpet of ice. The sound was deafening, like standing inside a drum while someone attacked it with sledgehammers. The hail shattered every window in Frank's house, punched holes in his metal roofing, and turned his wife's garden into a crater-filled wasteland. But Frank's vintage tractors, safely housed in their pole barn, suffered no damage at all. The building's metal roofing held against the assault, and the machines inside remained completely protected. The same could not be said for his neighbor's equipment. When the storm finally passed after 43 minutes of devastation, Frank walked outside to survey the damage. His own losses were significant. Roof damage to his house, destroyed outbuildings, and crops that looked like they'd been attacked with machetes. But as Frank looked across the countryside at his neighbors' farms, he realized that the storm had created a crisis unlike anything the region had ever experienced. Every piece of modern farming equipment within miles had been destroyed or severely damaged. Combines, tractors, planters, sprayers, and implements that represented millions of dollars in agricultural investment had been battered into uselessness by hailstones that had punched through metal panels, shattered glass cabs, and destroyed the delicate electronic systems that controlled modern machinery. Tom Bradley's fleet of state-of-the-art equipment looked like it had been attacked with sledgehammers. His $500,000 combine harvester had a cab that resembled a spider web of cracked safety glass, and every exterior panel showed dents from baseball-sized hail. More critically, the computer systems that controlled the machine had been destroyed by water damage when hail punched holes in the electrical housing. Sarah Chen's operation had suffered similar devastation. Her precision planting equipment, GPS-guided sprayers, and computerized tillage implements had been reduced to expensive scrap metal by the storm's fury. Mike Peterson, whose 3,200-acre operation represented the pinnacle of modern agricultural technology, faced losses exceeding $2 million. His fleet of machinery, which had been pride of the county just hours earlier, now looked like the aftermath of a bombing campaign. But the real crisis wasn't the equipment damage. It was the timing. August 15th was exactly 3 weeks before the start of corn harvest in Iowa. The corn crop, which had survived the hail with damage but was still harvestable, needed to be brought in within the next 21 days, or it would begin to deteriorate in the field. Soybeans would be ready for harvest 6 weeks later. The farmers of Millerville faced a nightmare scenario: crops that could be saved, but no equipment to harvest them with. Insurance would eventually cover the equipment losses, but insurance companies couldn't deliver new combines and tractors in 3 weeks. The wait time for new agricultural equipment had stretched to 8 months due to supply chain disruptions and manufacturing delays. Used equipment in harvestable condition was selling for premium prices and still required weeks or months for delivery and setup. The farmers of Millerville were facing the possibility of losing their entire year's income, not because their crops had been destroyed, but because they had no way to harvest them. That evening, as Frank walked through his pole barn, checking his vintage equipment for any storm damage, he found every machine in perfect working condition. The 1947 Farmall H that Tom Bradley had called a rust bucket started immediately and ran smoothly. The 1952 Ford 8N that Sarah Chen had dismissed as Grandpa's old tractor showed no signs of damage from the storm. The entire collection of supposedly obsolete machinery represented the only functional agricultural equipment within 50 miles of Millerville. Frank spent that night making phone calls to implement dealers, checking on parts availability, and developing a plan that would either save his neighbor's harvests or prove his decades of preparation had been worthwhile. The next morning, Tom Bradley became the first neighbor to swallow his pride and approach Frank's farm. Frank was in his workshop at 7 a.m. performing maintenance checks on his vintage equipment when he heard the crunch of gravel in his driveway. Through the window, he watched Tom Bradley park his pickup truck and sit for several minutes, apparently gathering courage for a conversation he'd never imagined having. When Tom finally knocked on the workshop door, his usual confidence had been replaced by obvious humility. "Frank," Tom said, removing his baseball cap and looking uncomfortable, "I need to talk to you about something." "Come on in," Frank replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "I heard you took a pretty hard hit yesterday." Tom nodded, looking around at the vintage tractors that he'd spent years mocking. For the first time, he seemed to see them as machines rather than curiosities. "Frank, I'm going to be straight with you. I've got 1 to 800 acres of corn that needs to come off in the next 3 weeks, and every piece of equipment I own got destroyed yesterday. My insurance company says they can't get me a replacement combine until next spring." Frank nodded sympathetically, but didn't speak. He could see how difficult this conversation was for Tom, and he wasn't going to make it harder by gloating or lecturing. "I know I've said some things over the years about your tractor collection." Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I need your help, Frank. I'll pay whatever you think is fair, but I need someone with working equipment to harvest my corn." Frank looked at his neighbor, a proud man who'd built one of the most successful farming operations in the county, now humbled by circumstances beyond his control, and made a decision that would define both their relationship and the future of agriculture in Millerville. "Tom, I've got equipment that can handle your harvest. The old machines are slower than what you're used to, but they'll get the job done. We'll need to modify some of my implements to work efficiently on your scale, but it's doable." Tom's relief was visible. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to understand that this isn't charity. This is neighbors helping neighbors, but it's also business. My equipment is valuable, my time is valuable, and my expertise is valuable. I'll charge you what it's worth, but I'll charge you fairly." "Absolutely, whatever you think is fair." Frank walked Tom through his collection, explaining which machines would be used for the harvest and how the operation would work. Tom listened with growing amazement as Frank detailed the capabilities of equipment he'd dismissed as worthless just days earlier. "This 1948 John Deere Model B," Frank explained, patting the green and yellow tractor's fender, "can pull a 4-bottom plow through ground that would bog down a modern machine twice its size. The design is simple, reliable, and effective. It's not fast, but it's steady, and it doesn't break down." As they walked through the barn, Frank explained his restoration philosophy and the principles that had guided his collecting decisions. These machines were built during an era when farmers couldn't afford downtime. Parts were expensive and dealers were scarce, so manufacturers designed equipment that could be repaired in the field with basic tools and ingenuity. They over-engineered everything because warranty claims were handled locally, and customer loyalty depended on reliability. Tom found himself genuinely impressed by the knowledge and craftsmanship that Frank had invested in his collection. Machines that had seemed like junk from a distance revealed themselves as expertly restored examples of agricultural engineering at its most practical and elegant. "Frank, I owe you an apology. I never understood what you were doing here. I thought you were just collecting old tractors as a hobby. I didn't realize you were preserving working solutions to problems we didn't know we might face." Frank accepted the apology with a nod, but his mind was already focused on the logistics of the harvest operation. "We'll start with your corn on Monday. I can provide 2 tractors and a combine, plus the labor to operate them. It'll take longer than your modern equipment would have, but we'll get it done." Word spread quickly through Millerville about Tom Bradley's arrangement with Frank Kowalski. By Thursday, Frank had received calls from 6 other farmers facing similar situations. Sarah Chen, Mike Peterson, the Williams family, the Johnson brothers, and several smaller operators all needed help harvesting crops with equipment that had survived the storm. Frank found himself in the unprecedented position of being the only farmer in the county with a complete fleet of working agricultural equipment. The machines that had been objects of ridicule for 15 years were suddenly the most valuable assets in Millerville. But Frank faced a problem. Even with his extensive collection, he didn't have enough equipment to handle the harvest needs of every farmer in the area. A single vintage combine could harvest perhaps 200 acres per day under good conditions, compared to the 500–800 acres that modern machines could cover. With over 15,000 acres of crops needing harvest in the affected area, Frank's equipment would be overwhelmed. That's when Frank implemented the second part of his plan, a plan he'd been developing for years but had never had occasion to use. Frank began making phone calls to vintage tractor enthusiasts, collectors, and restorers across the Midwest. He contacted museum curators, antique machinery clubs, and hobby farmers who maintained vintage equipment as weekend projects. Most importantly, he reached out to a network of collectors who'd been buying, selling, and trading vintage agricultural equipment for decades. "I need every working tractor, combine, and implement you can get to Iowa in the next week," Frank explained to each contact. "This isn't for a show or a demonstration. This is for a real harvest operation that will determine whether a dozen family farms survive this year." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Vintage equipment enthusiasts from Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, and Nebraska began loading tractors onto trailers and heading for Millerville. Collectors who'd spent years restoring machines for parades and shows suddenly found their hobby serving a critical practical purpose. Within 1 week, Frank's 40-acre property had been transformed into the largest gathering of working vintage agricultural equipment in the region's history. 37 tractors from Frank's personal collection were joined by 43 additional machines brought in by volunteers from across the Midwest. Combines from the 1950s and 1960s, restored to museum-quality condition but fully functional, arrived on trailers from farms and collections hundreds of miles away. The logistics of coordinating this operation challenged Frank's organizational skills, but it also proved the value of the relationships he'd built over 15 years of collecting and restoration. Every volunteer who arrived understood both the importance of the mission and the technical requirements of operating vintage equipment safely and effectively. Frank organized the volunteers into crews based on their experience and the type of equipment they'd brought. Experienced operators were paired with collectors who owned beautiful machines but had limited field experience. Frank's own restored tractors served as the foundation for each crew, providing the reliability and performance characteristics he'd spent years perfecting. The harvest operation that began on August 28, 2023, would be remembered as one of the most remarkable agricultural achievements in Iowa history. 80 tractors, ranging from 1940 to 1965 models, worked from dawn to dusk across the fields of Millerville. The vintage combines, operating at a pace that would have seemed leisurely during their original era, methodically harvested corn and soybeans with a precision and care that impressed even the farmers who'd been skeptical of their capabilities. Frank served as the operations coordinator, dispatching crews to different fields, managing maintenance issues, and ensuring that every farmer's crops were harvested in optimal condition. His workshop became a 24-hour repair facility, with Frank and several volunteer mechanics keeping the vintage fleet running through minor breakdowns and routine maintenance issues. The sight of dozens of vintage tractors working together in the fields drew spectators from across the region. Agricultural journalists, equipment enthusiasts, and curious neighbors gathered to watch machines from the golden age of American farming prove their continued relevance in modern agriculture. But for Frank, the most satisfying moment came when he saw his neighbors, the same people who'd mocked his collection for 15 years, working alongside the vintage equipment operators, learning to appreciate both the machines and the knowledge required to maintain them. Tom Bradley spent 3 days learning to operate a 1947 Farmall H, guided by a collector from Wisconsin who'd restored the machine from a rust bucket into a gleaming example of international harvester engineering. This old tractor has more character in its exhaust note than my modern equipment had in its entire computer system, Tom admitted to Frank one evening as they reviewed the day's harvest totals. Sarah Chen found herself fascinated by the mechanical simplicity and reliability of the vintage equipment. She spent hours asking technical questions about hydraulic systems, transmission designs, and maintenance procedures that had been refined over decades of field use. "I never realized how much knowledge was built into these old machines," she told Frank. "Everything is designed to be understood, repaired, and improved by the operator. Modern equipment treats the farmer like a computer user instead of a mechanic." The harvest operation was completed on September 18th, 3 days ahead of the most optimistic schedule Frank had projected. Every farm in the affected area had successfully harvested their crops, with quality and efficiency levels that exceeded what many farmers had expected from vintage equipment. The financial results were equally impressive. Frank charged each farmer his standard custom harvesting rates, significantly less than what they would have paid for modern equipment and operators, but sufficient to cover his costs and provide reasonable compensation for his expertise and equipment use. More importantly, the operation demonstrated the practical value of Frank's collecting philosophy. Machines that had been dismissed as museum pieces proved capable of handling modern farming challenges when properly maintained and operated. The success of the vintage harvest operation attracted national attention. Agricultural magazines, farming websites, and industry publications featured stories about the Millerville harvest, portraying it as both a remarkable example of community cooperation and a practical demonstration of vintage equipment capabilities. Frank was invited to speak at farming conferences, vintage tractor shows, and agricultural colleges about his experience and philosophy. He used these opportunities not to promote vintage equipment as superior to modern machines, but to advocate for a more balanced approach to agricultural mechanization. "The goal isn't to go backward in technology," Frank explained to an audience at Iowa State University. "The goal is to maintain capabilities and knowledge that can serve as backup systems when primary technologies fail. Modern equipment is incredibly sophisticated and effective, but it's also vulnerable to failures that can completely disable a farming operation." Frank's philosophy resonated with farmers who'd experienced the frustration of complex mechanical problems that required factory technicians and specialized diagnostic equipment to resolve. But the most significant long-term impact of the Millerville harvest was the change it created in relationships between Frank and his neighbors. Tom Bradley, who'd been Frank's harshest critic, became one of his strongest advocates and closest friends. The experience of working with vintage equipment had given Tom a new appreciation for both the machines and the knowledge required to maintain them. "Frank, I want to learn how to do what you do," Tom said 6 months after the harvest. "I want to buy some vintage equipment and learn to restore it properly. Would you be willing to teach me?" Frank was delighted to share his knowledge and workshop space with Tom, who proved to be an eager and capable student. Tom's first restoration project, a 1949 Ford 8N, took 8 months to complete, but resulted in a machine that Tom treasured more than any piece of equipment he'd ever owned. Sarah Chen took a different approach, focusing on acquiring knowledge rather than equipment. She spent hours in Frank's workshop learning mechanical skills, fabrication techniques, and troubleshooting methods that she applied to maintaining her modern equipment more effectively. "Understanding how these old machines work has made me a better mechanic on my new equipment," Sarah explained. "The principles are the same, even if the technology is different. Mike Peterson, whose losses had been the most severe, surprised everyone by purchasing a small collection of vintage equipment to serve as backup systems for his operation. Working with Frank, Mike developed a hybrid approach that combined modern efficiency with vintage reliability. "I learned that having all your eggs in one technological basket is risky," Mike said. "My vintage equipment might be slower, but it'll run when my modern equipment can't." The respect and admiration Frank earned from his neighbors extended beyond agricultural circles. The story of his collection and its role in saving the Millerville harvest became a local legend that attracted visitors from across the region. Frank's farm evolved from a curiosity into a destination for people interested in agricultural history, mechanical restoration, and practical applications of vintage technology. Frank began offering educational tours, restoration workshops, and technical consultations for farmers and collectors. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the Iowa Agricultural Hall of Fame, which inducted Frank in 2024 for his contributions to preserving agricultural heritage and demonstrating the practical value of vintage equipment knowledge. Frank Kowalski represents the best traditions of American agriculture. The Hall of Fame citation read, "His dedication to preserving and maintaining vintage equipment demonstrated that knowledge and craftsmanship from previous generations continues to have practical value in modern farming operations." Standing at the podium during his induction ceremony, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought him from mockery to recognition. 15 years ago, people thought I was crazy for collecting old tractors. They saw machines that belonged in museums or scrapyards. But I saw solutions to problems that hadn't happened yet, knowledge that might be needed someday, and capabilities that shouldn't be lost just because they're not fashionable. Frank looked out at an audience that included many of his former critics, now converted into believers and friends. "The machines in my barn are more than antiques or collectibles. They're working proof that sometimes the old ways are still the best ways, and sometimes the things people laugh at today become the things they depend on tomorrow." 2 years after the storm, Frank's collection has grown to over 60 tractors, and his operation has expanded to include a full-service restoration facility, an educational center, and a consulting business that helps farmers integrate vintage equipment into modern operations. The barn that was once called a tractor graveyard is now recognized as one of the most important collections of working vintage agricultural equipment in the Midwest. The machines that were dismissed as junk are now valued as critical infrastructure that can support modern farming when contemporary technology fails. Most importantly, Frank has successfully passed on his knowledge to a new generation of farmers who understand that progress doesn't always require abandoning the wisdom of the past. Tom Bradley, now an accomplished restorer in his own right, works with Frank to organize annual Heritage Harvest events where vintage equipment operators demonstrate historical farming techniques to thousands of visitors. Sarah Chen has established a scholarship program that sends young farmers to Frank's workshops to learn mechanical skills and restoration techniques. Mike Peterson has documented Frank's restoration methods in a series of technical manuals that serve as training materials for farmers and mechanics across the region. And Frank Kowalski, the man everyone laughed at for filling his barn with old tractors, continues to prove that sometimes the best preparation for an uncertain future is a deep understanding of a reliable past. If you've ever been mocked for following your passion, if you've ever been called crazy for preparing for problems other people don't see coming, if you've ever invested in knowledge that seemed useless until the moment it became essential, this story is for you. Frank Kowalski spent 15 years being laughed at for collecting machines that everyone else considered obsolete. But when crisis struck, those machines, and the knowledge required to maintain them, became the most valuable assets in his community. Sometimes the things people don't understand today become the things they desperately need tomorrow. Sometimes the hobbies others mock become the skills that save the day. Sometimes the wisdom to preserve the old ways proves more valuable than the rush to embrace the new. Thank you for watching this story. If it resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support more content like this. Share in the comments what passion or interest you've been mocked for. You might be surprised how many other people understand exactly what that feels like. And remember, the people who laugh at your preparation today might be the same people who beg for your help tomorrow. Stay true to your vision, trust your instincts, and never let other people's lack of understanding stop you from pursuing knowledge and capabilities that matter to you. Until next time, keep collecting, keep learning, and keep proving the doubters wrong.